Well, we are back to Deborah, and we're in our springtime of famous women of the Old Testament. Dun, dun, dun. We started with Ruth and did Esther. We're in Deborah right now. There's many other women we could do. But I think we'll stop on Deborah. There's so much to talk about even with Deborah. Last week we started Deborah, and next week we'll finish it. And the nice thing about Deborah is that it's a narrative, like everything in the Old Testament. It's a narrative. It's a story of a real event, and it's there for us to draw some conclusions as we step back and look at it. Now in Deborah, it's nice because we have the narrative, which we looked at in chapter 4 in Judges, and then we also have a commentary, a song in all of chapter 5. So today we're starting into that song, and the song itself will give us a few more clues about what happened, because there's still a little bit of mystery about how God accomplished what he did. All he can do anything he wants to, as well as some more details about some of the players. So the song is a nice commentary in the midst of that. You very seldom get this in the Old Testament. One of my favorite studies I've ever done does this in an artificial way, where you take a story about the life of David from, say, 1st or 2nd Samuel. You take the narrative of the story, and then you look up the psalm that was written in the midst of that story. And there's not many of them. There's about a dozen of them or so that have a marking on the psalm that says this was written when this was going on. And you can do that very same thing. You read the narrative, you find out the history of what happened, and then you pull up the psalm and you see what David wrote about in the song that he thought was notable in it. Great study. Well, we've got that right here in Judges 4 and 5 for the story of Deborah. Now, last week, I was sick most of the days before last Sunday, so I couldn't do what I'm going to do a little bit of today, which is give you a better geographical idea about what's going on in the actual narrative of Deborah. We went through the entire narrative last week with Deborah and Barak and the chariots and Sisera and all those, Jabin the king of Canaanites and all that stuff. We looked at that, but you didn't get a real idea of the battlefield. So we're going to do that today. Just before we look at the song, we're going to look at that geography. So here's my jukebox as our way of reminding us that we're actually looking at a song, and it's the Song of Deborah. It's how it's roughly related to. It's from Judges 5. So that's where we are today. Deborah, a mother in Israel. That's her own reference to herself that she'll say in this song later this morning. So we're in Judges 5. But again, the recap, let me go back to the recap. And here we go. So we're hovering over the Eastern Mediterranean. And as we are over the Eastern Mediterranean, we're going to zoom down on present-day Israel. This is what it looks like, by the way, a satellite view from the air. If you recall, the narrative is that we have Deborah, who has been spending the last decade or more in Israel. Let's see if this should actually move like a movie. There it goes. Okay, so back to this. If you can see this on your screen, we're zooming down in on Israel. And as we come in on present-day Israel, the elongated lake at the bottom, that's the Dead Sea. You go up the Jordan River Valley to the north, and there's the Sea of Galilee in the north. And to the right is Jordan, and there's some of the land demarcations as they're shown today. But our action today with Deborah's story is going to be in the north. So if we focus up toward the north, we're moving up toward the Sea of Galilee. There's a particular mountain that figures in the story we saw last week, and this is Mount Tabor. Mount Tabor is still called that to this very day. If you get a map in Israel, it'll show Mount Tabor. The B's and the V's in Hebrew are kind of confused. It's Tavor, but it's Tabor. It's the same place. So as you zoom in on Mount Tabor, you'll realize that Mount Tabor isn't like the mountains you think of here in the Rocky Mountains. It's really more of an isolated knoll. It's a bump basically on a flat plain, but it's a very prominent bump. And here's that bump. By the way, in these pictures right here, the heights are accentuated by a factor of 2, so it's not really that big, but just so you can get the dimensions. But there's Mount Tabor, at top of which Deborah told Barak to take 10,000 soldiers and put them at the top of this knoll, which makes them bait back actually for the bad guys, the chariot guys who run on this very flat plain that's all around Mount Tabor. In fact, this is the same plain that the Armageddon Valley is. If you look up to the top of the picture past that large lake where you hit the hills, that's actually Megiddo back there. This is Har Megiddo. This is the Valley of Armageddon, Jezreel Valley. So the chariot guys could easily maneuver around on this large piece of geography as long as it's flat, because chariots work on flat ground, and there's a ton of flat ground. And they were occupying more toward the coast over here, where the coastal plain, the Jezreel Valley, Har Megiddo, ends up toward the Mediterranean. You'll notice that as we stand right next to this modern-day defensive airport, that you see that things start to neck down because of that mountain, that ridge on the left. That mountain and ridge on the left, by the way, that's Mount Carmel. That's where Elijah battled with the prophets of Baal and all that kind of stuff. That's Mount Carmel. But the flat plain that the chariot guys, the 900 chariot guys are in, they actually were bivouacked. They lived right here in this narrow necking between Mount Carmel on the left and a smaller mountain on the right. And this is Harosheth Hagoyim. This is Harosheth Hagoyim, and it leads out to the sea. In the background, there's the Mediterranean. That's Haifa, the port of Haifa today. So these guys would sit in this narrow neck with their 900 chariots, and from this control point, they could venture out on this gigantic plain, and on this plain they could control passage all over this entire area because 900 chariots can make their way to any part of this plain anytime. If you go straight in the picture, you'll end up at the top end of the sea, of the Dead Sea and the Jordan River Valley that goes to the south. If you veer to the left, you end up toward the Sea of Galilee. I mean, this is a place that everyone passes through because it's easy walking. You don't have to walk on any mountains. So their chariots could go over the entire area and command and control everything that went on. So when they got word that there were 10,000 of their enemies up on top of this knoll called Mount Tabor up on the left up there, all they had to do is venture out into this flat plain and go up to this knoll, as it were. Now, their chariots are never going to make it to the top of that knoll, to the mountain, but they can completely surround it quite easily. And we looked last week that if they just encircled it at the base, it would be about a 6-mile perimeter base. And for 900 chariots, that's spaced every 35 feet. So they could easily surround this and cut it off so that the guys at the top would starve. So they could do a very classical technique of just starving out the people inside their control and never have to lift a sword to do anything. Okay, so this is the setting. 10,000 guys at the top of that. Here's the plain that they control. And before we go on and talk more about this, on the left, by the way, is Nazareth passing by in that the white area. As we go back to Harosheth Hagoyim, this narrow necking where they could control the traffic from the Mediterranean into the flat plain. They could ask taxes from whoever went on. This is where the guys lived. Harosheth Hagoyim is on the middle right there in the necking down between Mount Carmel and the smaller stuff. And before we go on, so here's the idea, is they went, 10,000 guys went on the top of Mount Tabor, which is over there on the left, and it's a great way to get surrounded and killed, basically. And then down here on the right is Harosheth Hagoyim. By the way, this Harosheth is a proper name. Hagoyim is a descriptor. If you get Jewish friends, they'll talk about the Goyim or the Goy. Gentiles. The word for Gentiles is Goy. If you're a Gentile, you're Goy. If there's 2 Gentiles in a room, plural, it's Goyim. So, and Hagoyim with a proper definitive thing in front makes it our or the. So this is Harosheth of the Goy. Harosheth of the Gentiles is what it is. And interestingly enough, if you get on Google Earth and you zoom in on that little narrow neck of land over there, you know what that little village is called to this very day? Well, okay, let me do this first. That's where the chariot attack is going to be, right? Across over there. Here's what it looks like on Google Earth today. Kiryat Harosheth. Even to this very day. Here we are thousands of years later, and it's still called Harosheth. There's just no question about where this place is. So that's where the chariot guys live. They're going to take their chariots out on that flat plain as soon as they get news that the 10,000 guys get on Mount Tabor, and they're just going to wait it out until they all die up there, and there never has to be a battle. This is perfect bait for the chariot guys. Unfortunately, when we read the story last week, they don't even get close to Mount Tabor. The battle actually happens right here, right at the gate coming out of Harosheth Hagoyim. And how is that possible? That's the question. And how is it that God gave them the victory that 10,000 guys on Mount Tabor can somehow overpower 900 chariots as they head out to go after them? So part of that question will be answered when we take a look at the song today. Okay, just to give you an idea as well, here's the lay of the land for the different tribes. Remember when we went through Joshua about this time last year? The tribes settled in different areas. Well, the highlands between us and Mount Tabor right there, where Nazareth and Canaan is to this present day, it's up above the flat plain. That's Zebulun. That's the tribe of Zebulun. North of them, which is to the left here, since we're looking sort of to the east, southeast, north of them is Naphtali, and they occupy the areas to the north of there on this west side of the Sea of Galilee, which you can't see. It's down in a hollow on the left over there. So we got Zebulun and Naphtali. Zebulun is overlooks right on the edge of the entire plain. So these two tribes themselves are separated from the bulk of their cousins in Israel to the south because of the marauding chariots in the flat plain. And who lives in the flat plain? Issachar does. So these are the three players, the three most affected tribes by this bullying that's going on by these 900 chariots. And by the way, just behind us here, we're hovering over Haifa right now, but down here at the bottom is the tribe of Asher. Asher is the flat coastal region that starts from Harosheth Hagoyim on the right there, comes out to the coast. We're actually standing right above the coastline, and up the coast, up to Lebanon to your left, that's Asher. So these tribes will be mentioned as we take a look at the story. Naphtali and Zebulun are cut off from the rest of Israel, and Issachar is overrun by them. So these guys have a personal stake in the story. The rest of the country is to the south. Judah, Reuben, Ephraim, all those guys are to the south. They're not so much affected by it, but they are cut off from Zebulun and Naphtali and somewhat from Asher, and definitely the oppression of Issachar because of these guys. So they have a real dog in this fight. Okay, so let's go to the song and let's see what Deborah tells us about on the song. Then sang Deborah and Barak, the son of Abinoam, on that day. Again, jukebox. Does anyone know what a jukebox is anymore? Okay, there we go. Excellent. Okay. So here's the song that they sang on that day to commemorate what happened in such large form. So it starts off with, "Listen up, you kings." The song starts off with kings. Well, that the leaders took the lead in Israel, which is a novel idea. The leaders took the lead in Israel. That the people offered themselves willingly. They came and volunteered. Bless the Lord. And so that's what this is a story about. That some leaders in Israel, after 20 years of oppression of these chariots, the leaders led and the people offered themselves willingly. Bless the Lord. So that's what this song is about. So listen up, you kings. Hear, O kings. Give ear, O princes. To the Lord I will sing. I'll make melody to the Lord, the God of Israel, who actually is the hero of the story. So if you're a king or you're a prince, think you're in charge of things, listen up, because this is the day everything changed. Riders on the storm. I had to pick out a few songs. What can I do? Okay. So when Deborah starts off this song, she just started off by saying, "You leaders, listen up." But then she does something really strange right here. Look what she says. "Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom, the earth trembled and the heavens dropped. Yes, the clouds dropped water." Well, before I finish this thought, this is weird. Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom. Well, where's Seir and Edom? Seir and Edom, think about the bottom end of the Dead Sea on the eastern side, of what is present-day Jordan today. So that's where Esau settled Edom, and Seir's the mountains back there. So what Deborah is saying right here is that the Lord somehow marched out of the deep southeast part of the state and participated in this battle. In sort of like, in a way, it says the heavens dropped and the clouds dropped water, like a big storm. And maybe a thunderstorm. The mountains quaked before the Lord, even Sinai before the Lord, the God of Israel. So the picture she paints at the very beginning here isn't a clash of chariots. It seems like a gigantic thunderstorm coming out of the southeast, sort of looking like this. See, when I'm not sick, you get sound effects. So in a sense, what she's saying is that what happened here is not exactly what meets the eye. There was God himself marching in power and might into the midst of this situation. Was it a real thunderstorm? Well, hold that judgment for a second. But clearly, the power broker in this story is not Sisera, the general of the chariots. It's not Barak, the general of the Israelites. It's not Deborah. It's none of those people. It's God himself who marched into the scene. And that's how she starts the song. God marched into the scene like a gigantic thunderstorm. Well, then she talked about the context. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Actually, it wasn't the best of times at all. It was the worst of times. It was just the worst of times. Why? Well, this is where she goes on. In the days of Shamgar, the son of Anath, in the days of Jael. So we're kind of getting historical context. Who is Shamgar? read the chapter just before the Deborah story. Go to the end of Judges 3. Judges 4 is where we actually get the narrative. Judges 3, Shamgar is the last guy, and just to kind of do a little plot spoilage for you, Shamgar is just mentioned in passing as a guy who kills a whole bunch of other people. Boom. And then we jump into Deborah. So it's during the time of Shamgar, who was quite noble in that particular sense, probably 20 years before this happened. In the days of Jael, she's the woman we saw last week who did the tent peg thing. So here we have the great warrior Shamgar at the end of Judges 3. And oh, by the way, in Judges 4, you got Jael. The juxtaposition is it's just wonderful. It's just wonderful. It's great. So in those days, when things are just kind of falling apart, the highways were abandoned and travelers kept to the byways. Why? Well, because of the chariot dominance and going through the center part of the country, you just couldn't travel without being molested by these brutal bullies and chariots and other people. The place basically was dysfunctional, is what she's saying. The highways were, no one dared to go on the highways. Travelers stayed at home. It's kind of like right now, where everyone's kind of sequestered to their house. I mean, no one went out, just because to go out was a dangerous thing. It was all wild and woolly west. The villagers ceased in Israel, that is, the village life ceased in Israel. No one came out of their tents. The villagers ceased in Israel. They ceased to be until I, Deborah, arose as a mother in Israel. So all this was bad. It was the worst of times. Village life was horrible. Traveling out in the open was horrible. And Deborah says, this is what was going on. But then it finally ceased when I decided to arise. I, Deborah, and who am I, a general? An appointment of some king? I'm a mother in Israel. And we'll talk more about that. I just love how she self-titles herself. Not as she could have self-titled herself, as the narrative back in chapter 4 talked about, as a prophetess, or as a judge who was out judging civil matters under the palm of Deborah. She doesn't quote that at all. She says, the country was dysfunctional until I arose. I'm a mother in Israel. It's as though if the leaders and the generals aren't going to arise, I can do it. And so that's what she does. It's not a statement of rank or privilege. It's just a statement of ordinariness in the face of all this bad stuff. Village life ceased until I arose. What was going on? What makes the worst of times? Well, when new gods were chosen, then war was at the gate. So basically, Israel had come in with Joshua and settled the land under the leadership of Joshua and the guidance of God. And they followed God. Choose this day whom you're going to serve. Remember that from Joshua? Well, now you get here decades later, and they're following other gods, foreign gods of other places. So Deborah's saying, that's a bad deal. New gods were chosen in the country, and as a result, God withdrew his protection he promised them if they would follow him. And so war was in the gates. There was bad stuff coming on the edge of all of our villages. Was shield or spear to be seen among 40,000 Israel? And rhetorically, the answer is no. So even though this oppression came because they no longer followed God, God withdrew his protection of them. There's still Canaanite influence in the area, like Jabin, the king up there in Hatzor, and his general Sisera and his 900 chariots. No one's resisting it. There's no shield or spear that's being there to kind of stand up for themselves and push themselves out. It's just not happening. So she says, my heart goes out to the commanders of Israel who offered themselves willingly among the people. I mean, the leadership said, let's rise up and push these people out. It worked during the days of Joshua when God was leading us. Let's rise up right now and get rid of this Canaanite remnant that's left in the country. We can do this. So the leaders led up, and I bless them. My heart goes out to them, and bless the Lord for people like this. But there was no response from the people. So now we're going to sing a new song. That's the context. So she says, before we get to the meat of the song, this particular song, you need to sing it everywhere. Tell of it, you who ride on white donkeys, you who sit on rich carpets, and you who walk by the way. This is basically saying the people who ride on white donkeys, they are the people with the Mercedes-Benzes. So if you move around the country in Mercedes-Benzes and nice leather upholstery, that's the rich carpets. It's like what you put on the top of the donkey. If that's you, if you're a person of privilege, or instead you're just a person who walks by the way, you got no donkeys. Doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, you need to sing this song. You need to sing this song. Tell this song everywhere you go. In fact, do it to the sound of musicians at the watering places, where people gather together and you sing a song at the watering places. There, They repeat the righteous triumphs of the Lord, the righteous triumphs of his villagers in Israel. So sing this song everywhere you go, rich or poor, Mercedes or on foot, at the watering holes or anywhere, and sing about what? Sing about the righteous triumphs of the Lord, and sing about the righteous triumphs of the villagers of Israel. Finally, the villagers rise up, follow the leadership, and they do something about it. Sing this song. So here we're going to recount the story. So the players enter in the story. Judges 5 again. Then down to the gates march the people of the Lord. By the way, if you live inside a walled city, you have to come down to the gate to get out of the city, to go out and do stuff. So they're leaving the safety of their city. Down to the gates march the people of the Lord. And then should I stay or should I go? That's very weak. So there's actually a question about not everybody came forward. So awake, awake, Deborah, awake, awake, break out in a song, arise, Barak, that's the general of Israel, lead away your captives, O son of Abinoam. So they're awake, they're leading, and then down march the remnant of the noble. What a great phrase. The remnant of the noble, those people who felt they had just and ethical cause to push out these Canaanite chariots. These are the remnant of the noble, people who realize that this injustice has to be stopped. The people of the Lord marched down for me against the mighty. The people of the Lord marched down for me against the mighty. Now that by itself, we'll come back to that phrase, because Deborah is saying they left the safety of their villages, they came out the gates, and they willingly marched out against the mighty ones, against the chariots. That's just really selfless. And who? Well, from Ephraim, that's a tribe in Israel. From Ephraim, their route, they marched down into the valley. So we've got people from Ephraim, which is not in the north. Notice we didn't mention that on the map. They're further south from this area. They're just to the south of these plains. But people from Ephraim, they marched down into the valley, the flat plain where the chariots go. Following you, Benjamin with your kinsmen. So Benjamin, very small tribe. They actually contributed people. They're further south of Ephraim. They came up. They contributed people to help in this fight on the plains. From Maker, marched down the commanders. And on the upper right, you see right there, Maker is just kind of a catchphrase for the tribe of Manasseh. Remember, Manasseh was split left and right on the Jordan. This is the left side. This is the West Bank guys. So this West Bank Manasseh folks, they came up with Benjamin and Ephraim. They're right next to each other in the layouts. So they came up. They marched down with the commanders. Zebulun, remember the guys who have a dog in the fight? Zebulun's very affected by being cut off from the rest of the country. Zebulun, those who bear the lieutenant's staff, the direction of their leadership. Who else? Well, the princes of Issachar. Remember Issachar? They're the ones that live in the plain that are being bullied by these chariots. Princes of Issachar came with Deborah. And Issachar, faithful to Barak. So the Issachar comes and follows both the leadership of Deborah and Barak. Into the valley, that's the flat plain, they rushed at his heels, at the heels of Barak leading. So who else? Well, among the clans of Reuben, there were great searchings of heart. See, the previous tribes, they just kind of rushed right out there and helped. But in Reuben, they're kind of going, well, I don't know. I'm searching my heart. And Deborah kind of sarcastically says, so what were you doing? Why did you sit still among the sheepfolds to hear the whistling of the flocks? Is that what you're doing? You staying home to hear the whistling of the flocks? How about Reuben? And then restates it again. Among the clans of Reuben, there were great searchings of heart. This is very tongue-in-cheek. So, yeah, I like that. So all those other clans who came down, who brought soldiers into the battle against the mighty, then there's a little bit of disrespect going on here saying, Reuben, where were you, Reuben, in all this call out? Were you sitting with the sheep? Because if you remember in the settling the land, Reuben was very much into his animals. So what were you doing? Listening to the whistling for the flocks. You led your sheep by whistling and they followed you. So what were you doing? When Issachar and Zebulun and Naphtali and all these guys, Ephraim, they're pumping out these soldiers at the risk of their own lives. What are you doing? Sitting with your sheep? It's a great piece of irony right here. And how about Gilead? Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan. Well, Gilead, that's a catchphrase for the whole region on the eastern side of the Jordan, even to this day. It's the eastern side of the Jordan. It's where Gad is, because remember, the eastern side, you have Reuben and Gad and Manasseh. Gad's over there. So Gilead, how about you guys? Just stayed home? Yeah, just stayed beyond the Jordan. And Dan, how about you? Why did he stay with the ships? This is referring to Dan's original position and when they came in with Joshua right on the coast, down in present-day Joppa, down that area. And so it was very much a port-oriented kind of Mediterranean tribe. Dan, what are you doing? Standing with the ships? What are you doing? Buffing down the brass on the rails of your ship? What are you doing? Standing with the ships? How about you, Asher? And we talked about Asher. They're the ones that are on the coast in the north up toward Lebanon. What will you do? Sit still on the coast of the sea? Stand by his landings? What were you doing? Hanging out in the sea? Watching the sunrise, sunset? Yeah. These are clearly kind of cursings against these tribes. But Zebulun is a people who risk their lives to the death. And Naphtali, too, on the heights of the field. So these guys responded, but again, they're the ones that are probably the most directly impacted by the chariot bullies. But they came down and they risked their lives to the death. And what was Reuben doing? Sitting with the sheep. Yeah. So now the clash happens in the song. We recount what's going on. We have more idea who's actually in the clash. So the kings came, they fought, then fought the kings of Canaan. That's a nice kind of double way of putting the fight goes on. At Anath, by the waters of Megiddo, they got no spoils of silver. So now it's telling us here exactly where it takes place. And in that picture that we saw a second ago, the map, Harosheth HaGoyim is tucked up close to Mount Carmel. Well, right next to close to Mount Carmel as it travels inland is the river Kishon. The river Kishon follows the base of that and goes off past Megiddo, where we get the name for Armageddon, and then about 5 miles past that to Ta'anak. So we're staying close to the mountains of Mount Carmel. We're not way out in the plain over to Mount Tabor. Somehow we're stuck next to the mountains. They come out of Harosheth HaGoyim. They take off like a bat out of hell. I mean, they just take off, but they never seem to turn east and go down the plain toward Mount Tabor. They get stuck at the foot of the mountains, right at the river Kishon. And that's where Ta'anak is. It's right there next to Megiddo. Wow. From heaven the stars fought. From their courses they fought against Sisera. And here Deborah brings back in again, if this doesn't make sense to you, part of that is because heaven is involved in this clash. Not just the players that we mentioned before. From heaven the stars fought. From their courses they fought against Sisera. Divine help. The torrent Kishon. The torrent Kishon swept them away. The ancient torrent, the torrent Kishon. The Kishon River is what hugs up next to Mount Carmel as you come out of Harosheth HaGoyim. So evidently, as you put the pieces together, they were tempted by the bait at the top of Mount Tabor. The chariots all revved to go. The horses are revved to pull them out. They depart out of Harosheth HaGoyim, right smack dab next to the banks of the Kishon River. And it appears as though, based on the clues Deborah's giving us, that this storm comes in from the southeast that no one could predict. This storm comes in, the hand of God. It swells the sudden rush of water that comes out, and the only place for it to go to off of Carmel, and even that whole plain, is the Kishon River, which hugs up against Mount Carmel and actually goes through Harosheth HaGoyim. So as they take off out of Harosheth HaGoyim, what happens? They get stuck. They get stuck in the mud. Now, it's pretty clear. You can find another place in 1 Kings where people knew that when you had chariots that were on flat plains, you never used chariots in the spring. And why? Because spring rains made muck on the ground and chariots couldn't move. They got stuck. They lost all of their tactical advantage of being able to attack quickly and take out a lot of people. They got stuck. So here, it looked like it was a pretty good bet, but what they didn't know is that God was bringing a storm, and it came in, it swelled the Kishon and all the region around that, and suddenly they were just stuck. They never turned east to Tabor. They were stuck just a few miles from home. This seems like what happened. The ancient torrent, the torrent Kishon, who would ever have been able to tell? And they just got stuck. Now, interestingly enough then, they get stuck right at the base of Mount Carmel, just a minute or two out of Harosheth HaGoyim. And Mount Tabor is still way at the end of that plain. They have enough time to come off of Mount Tabor, to come down the entirety of Mount Tabor, to walk across the entire plain and come all the way over to Megiddo and Ta'anak and to the base of Mount Carmel. They have enough time to walk that entire plain, and these guys are still trying to get unstuck out of the mud. And there's nothing they can do. They're just stuck. They're just totally stuck. This explains why Sisera got out of his chariot we saw last week, because he was stuck. Couldn't go anywhere. The chariot had no advantage to him. March on, my soul, with might. Woo-hoo! The torrent Kishon. Who would ever have figured that the issue was an unexpected storm? And that's why when Deborah starts the song, she starts with this illusion of God being a mighty power coming out of the southeast. That's a very unexpected storm direction. Comes out of the southeast and overwhelms the situation. That's the story here. Not anything about the relative power of might and tactics between chariots and foot soldiers, or about the tactic of going up on top of Tabor. It's about God himself coming visibly in power to surprise the mighty. That's what this is all about. Wild horses couldn't drag me away. Okay, never mind. And then she puts in an interesting thing right here. So they're stuck in the muck on the river Kishon, and the horses are trying to get themselves out. And she gives us a nice audio clip. Then loud beat the horses' hoofs. There's great descriptive words. This loud beat the horses' hoofs with the galloping of the steeds. Well, normally if you're into a Western and you hear horses galloping in a Western, we watched a Western last night with Burt Lancaster. It was great. You hear this, that's the galloping, right? Well, this is poorly translated. This is just the pound. This is the pounding of hooves on the ground. Just think more of, since this is the swollen Kishon River, think more like a toilet plunger going in and out of the mud. That's what this sound is, and she emphasizes it in the song. Is they're stuck. They're stuck up to the axles. They can't get out. The horses are being whipped to pull them out of the mud. They can't pull them out of the mud. And what do you hear in that scene? You hear guys shouting, and you hear the hoofs hitting the mud, sucking back and forth, desperately trying to get them out. And she says, this is what you hear. You hear 900 chariots of horses desperately pounding the mud, trying to pull these chariots out. That's what you hear. So how's the story end? Well, Judges 4:16 we looked at last week. And Barak pursued the chariots and the army to Harosheth Hagoyim. And all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left. Now see, that's amazing, because they're just barely out of Harosheth Hagoyim. They just got maybe a mile or two. Maybe 5 miles out of Harosheth Hagoyim. So if you remember, if you wind back to the story in chapter 4, and it's just before this, remember, they're up at the top of Mount Tabor, and Deborah and Barak are up there, and they're looking down the valley, and they're waiting to see, because God said he would draw them out, and they're waiting to see any sign of the chariots coming out of Harosheth Hagoyim. And they come out of Harosheth Hagoyim, and then Deborah says, look, the Lord has given them into your hands. Well, when she said, look, what did they see? They saw 900 chariots stuck in a flash flood of mud. That's what they saw. They saw. So when Deborah says, check it out, they're stuck. And then she says to Barak, so get your men and go. Just get your men and go. So it actually makes a lot of sense that she would make such a wild statement to Barak, saying, now's the time, take your men. Was it a matter of faith? No, it was a matter of just looking. God had done something and intervened on their behalf and stuck all the 900 chariots right at the mouth of Harosheth Hagoyim, right next to Mount Carmel, right next to that river Kishon, and they were stuck and they could not get out, and all they could see was 900 chariots as sitting targets. So they calmly came out from Mount Tabor, they walked across the plain, and they went and they killed them all. Some of them tried to return back into Harosheth Hagoyim, presumably because there was some defenses there. We don't know. But they were right there anyway. But that's how 10,000 men could take over 900 chariots, because the chariots were just dead. They were like tanks without any gasoline. They were no advantage at all. So that's what we see. And again, this is consistent with what God promised. Remember what God promised? Through Deborah to Barak, God says, go, gather your men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun. Remember the people of the north who had a stake in this game? Take 1,000, put them on the Mount Tabor, and I will draw out Sisera, which is what happened, drew him out, great bait, and the general of Jabin's army, to meet you where? By the river Kishon, with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. So God had already said, this battle is not going to make its way to Mount Tabor. but you need to go to Mount Tabor as bait to draw these guys out. You need to come to Mount Tabor as bait, but you know what? The battle's going to be way back up the valley, right on the Kishon River. How can that be? No one could have ever predicted it. God himself was going to strand the chariots in the mud. That's what happened. So as we close out the song, there's some curses and some shame. So she goes on, curse Meroz, says the angel of the Lord, curse its inhabitants. What's Meroz? We're not exactly sure. I did a lot of searching on this. In general, people said, Meroz, that's just a general catchphrase for all the people who should have helped, but didn't. So curse them, says who? The angel of the Lord. There was an expectation from God's end of things that people throughout the entire country would contribute to the battle and eradicate this Canaanite presence, but they didn't. Those who should have helped didn't. Curse Meroz, curse its inhabitants thoroughly. It's really kind of a sobering statement that they should have come to the aid, which raises an interesting question in a second we'll get to. And then goes on, because they did not come to the help of the Lord against the mighty. Now this is the question, and we're going to end with this verse today, and we'll do a little thinking about it. Let me just read again. Because they did not come to the help of the Lord, that's a repeat that's in the stanza, against the mighty. So the question that arises in my mind is, did God need their help? Seems like God did this all by himself. Really? I mean, why is he cursing those who should have helped but didn't when God had control of the entire thing? And why is it they didn't come and help the Lord against the mighty, the chariots? So it raises a question we're going to look at in just a second, because here's God who's orchestrated the situation. He's brought a storm out of the southeast. He's stranded and stuck the chariots in the mud up on the river Kishon, right out of the gates of Harosheth-Hagoyim. They were sitting targets for the 10,000. Why are we going to curse the people like Reuben and those guys who didn't come? I mean, after all, God had this. But they're cursed because they did not come to the help of the Lord. That's a fascinating phrase. So we're going to spend a little time talking about that, because that's really odd. Okay, so here we are, Song of Deborah. Remember, we push back, we draw some conclusions. That is not the entire Song of Deborah. It's most of it, and I've left out the last third of it. We'll look at next week, because it takes a very interesting twist before we finish the song. It sounds like the song should stop here, really. It talked about it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. People were looking after other gods. Deborah and Barak, top of Mount Tabor, thunderstorms, they're all dead. Chased them back to Harosheth-Hagoyim. End of story. God's to be praised. But there's still more. So you'll see them more next week. But just with what we have, let's draw a couple of conclusions. Let me ask this first. Who's glorified in this song and who's vilified in this song? Because, and I ask that because whenever you write a song about an incredible event, you usually praise someone in the song. You usually say, this was an incredible event, good job so-and-so, or bad job. So there's usually good guys and bad guys. So let's think through it. In the song that you've sung so far, most of the song, who's glorified? And so let's just kind of go through the list and check and see what we think. So was Deborah glorified in the song? No, it said that she arose a mother in Israel. That's about all the credit she gets. She arose a mother in Israel. Not even a prophetess in that particular sense. How about Barak, the general of Israel, the leader? Collected 10,000 guys from Zebulun and Naphtali. Responsible for great battlefield tactics? No, he just went to the top of the mountain like Deborah had said God told him to do, and then kept them up there until Deborah turned to him and said, look, take them. No, I mean, that's just not Barak. How about someone like Jael, who does the tent peg thing? She's not even mentioned yet. She'll be mentioned next week. But is she? No, they're not glorified at all, and yet they're the principal players on the whole battle. So who is glorified? Well, not them. Look, this is how, on that day, God subdued Jabin, the king of Canaan. Remember, Jabin he's the boss. He's the king of Sisera. God subdued Jabin, the king of Canaan, before the people of Israel. That's the commentary at the end of the narrative in Judges 4. And then it goes on in the song. Deborah says, to the Lord I'll sing. I'll make melody to the Lord, the God of Israel. And then goes on, Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom, the earth trembled. It's God who did these things. He's the one that did all that kind of stuff. Judges 5:11. There they repeat it. When they do the song, they repeat the righteous triumphs of the Lord. So clearly, verse 20, chapter 5. From heaven the stars fought, from their courses they fought against Sisera. So, yeah. So, okay. So who gets the glory in the song? God does. Beginning to the end. There are players in the song, and those players we just mentioned, Deborah, Barak, Jael, Sisera, I mean, all these guys, they're players in the story. But who's in control of the story? Who's the only one who can be glorified in the story? It's God himself. Because without God, this would have been a massacre. And this was God's idea to start with, spoken through the prophetess, Deborah, to the ears of General Barak, who said, okay, and they did it. So God's the one who's glorified. Well, on the flip side, who's vilified in the story? Well, interestingly enough, the ones who are vilified is not Sisera and Jabin. Oh, clicker's not working. There we go. Who's vilified over here? Reuben is. Reuben's vilified. Why? Well, because he should have helped. Because he should have helped. These are the ones he's talking about. They should have come to the aid of the other tribes in the north, even though they weren't directly impacted. Reuben, remember, is on the west side. Did I put that right? It's on the east side of the Jordan River. So they're separated from the threat of the chariots by the Jordan River. I mean, it's not a problem for them. So what if their cousins are all cut off? So they were thinking very selfishly in that sense. You know, well, we got animals to take care of here, so good luck with that life and death struggle you guys are having. Yeah. Reuben's vilified. Who else is vilified? Gad, the other guys who live on the other side of the Jordan, which is a natural separation from the bullies and the chariots. They didn't care. They didn't come. Gad didn't come. Who else? Dan, the guys who are too busy dealing with their boats on the ocean, on the Mediterranean Sea. And also Asher, who also were the seaside guys, both of which are immune from the effects of the chariots. Totally immune. So they just stayed at home and did nothing. These are the ones that are vilified. And so this brings up the really gigantic question. If God's the one who's control of the outcome of this battle, why is it such a big deal that a lot of people didn't show up? That's the bigger question. I mean, last week we asked the big question is, how did God accomplish what he accomplished in this battle? And now we know from the song it was because of this storm, it looks like, and because of bogging down the chariots in muck, and they were just stuck. Okay, we get that, and God still did that, although we can explain the effect. God did that. I mean, the timing that's a God thing. But why is God going to curse people who don't come and participate in it when God's clearly got it? And that's the question of the moment with the Deborah story. And that's what we're going to explore just a little bit before we finish. Remember, it says this in Judges 5:23, right in the middle of the song, end of the song. Curse Meroz, says the angel of the Lord. This is heaven's opinion on this. Curse its inhabitants thoroughly, because they did not come to the help of the Lord, against the mighty. Well, God doesn't need our help. And there's the cusp of the problem when you're reading this narrative. Why is it such a big deal? I mean, doesn't it make more sense that God would glorify himself the fewer people that came out? But yet here the point is that they didn't come out to help the Lord in this battle, and that's a big deal. Curse them thoroughly. So this is where the narrative allows you to kind of kick back for a second and say, I don't quite understand this. The bad guys in this song should be Sisera. It should be the bad general guy, the guy in charge of the Harosheth Hagoyim bivouac with all the 900 chariots. He should be the bad guy. Jabin the king in Hatzor, which is just to the north of Naphtali. These should be the bad guys. Why are the bad guys the non-participating tribes of Israel? And why is it that necessary? Well, let's think on this for a second. Remember it said in Judges 5:13, then marched down the remnant of the noble. The people of the Lord marched down from me against the mighty. This is a very carefully crafted phrase. They marched the remnant of the noble. Who were the noble in Israel? Who were the noble when Joshua came in the land in Israel? The ones who were noble in Israel, who were the ones who took God at his word and followed him and took the land based on God's promise. Those were the noble. Those are the ones that did that. And that was just maybe less than a generation before this story. So they're the noble. They're the ones that actually believe God when God says, I'll give you this land and you'll do this. And as well extended against the Canaanites. And then the second phrase is very particular. The people of the Lord marched down from me against the mighty. Remember, as Deborah starts the song, the best of times and the worst of times, it was the worst of times because she says everyone had brought up new gods. They were no longer following God himself. So who were the ones that came into the battle? The ones who were the few, the remnant of the noble? It was the ones who still trusted in God and his promises on their behalf. And so when God said, we're going to do a risky maneuver, but I'm your God, I'm leading you, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. It's just like turn back to the clocks of the time of Joshua when we came into the land. Oh, look, there's bad guys in the land, but God says, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. Do you take God at his word? Do you trust what he says? See, that's the issue. Well, evidently at this time there was only a remnant of those noble ones. Noble not in the sense of wise or powerful with a sword. Noble in the sense they would trust God, and they would trust God's leading, and they would trust that God would deliver them and that this was his battle and not theirs. Those people, the ones who put God first in that sense, are called the people of the Lord. That's why he specifically names the land. Not just residents of the promised land, people of the Lord. And what did they do? Against the odds, they marched down from me against the mighty. So they saw the might of the chariots, that's the mighty. They said, you know what, we're sitting ducks if we go out on a battlefield with swords and brooms or whatever we got. The chariots are a bad deal. That's mighty. That's an imbalance of power. But these remnant of the noble said, that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter because God has commanded this and God's got this. So what we really see right here in the cursings of the Reubens and the Gileads and all those guys, in the cursing, it isn't the cursing about the fact that you just sat home and stayed comfortable. It's a cursing about the fact that you would not take God at his word, that God's got this. So you stayed home. It's exactly the same. It's the same heart condition before they came into the promised land, where they left Egypt and they came up to the edge of the promised land after the Exodus, and they sent some spies into the land. The spies came back and said, great place, we need to take this place. But then 10 out of the 12 spies said, but you know, there's giants in the land, so this is impossible. And so that generation wandered in the desert for 40 years and stayed in the desert. And it says, the writer of Hebrews says, they didn't enter because of disbelief. What did they disbelieve? They didn't believe God could do it. That's what it was. And so now we have the recurring of that heart condition in the ones who decided not to participate in what God was going to do. And so they're cursed. They're cursed in the sense that they've actually lost a gigantic opportunity to see the hand of God up close and personal as he intercedes on your behalf as you've been overcome by justice for 2 decades. And you've missed it. You missed the party because you wouldn't believe you could do this. That's what we're talking about right here. See this word mighty right here? That word means an obvious danger. It's an obvious danger. But who is the more obvious winner and supreme in the whole situation? God himself is. So here it is. You come back exactly to what Paul was saying. We don't walk by sight, we walk by faith. If you walk by sight here, you'll say, the chariots are bigger and worse than us. They'll get us every time. We're sitting ducks. They've done this for 20 years. This is horrible. That's might. That's your eyes telling you that this is not going to work. In human terms, this is not going to work. But by faith, we understand that what God promises is true and he'll fulfill it because his promise always happens and it's fueled by his love for us. You walk by faith about who God is and his character, your knowledge of his character, or do you walk by sight, which is what Reuben and Gilead and Anath, all those guys did, said, no, we're not going to enter this battle. We don't think God's got this. God may have said something through Deborah the prophetess, but, who knows? She might have just been drinking, so I don't know. We don't trust her. Well, they wouldn't trust that God's word was solid in this situation. And again, like the previous generation, they wouldn't believe that God would carry through with his word. So interestingly enough, we have echoes of Joshua coming into the land. There were people who wouldn't believe that God could do this. There was debate about that. But Joshua says, no, it's going to happen. God's got this. And don't forget, be strong and courageous. That has more to do with adherence to God's promises. Be strong and courageous. Because remember, God said, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. Do you believe that in the face of might, or don't you? Do you walk by faith in that statement, or by sight of what you see? That's the cusp of what's going on right here. Also, when you look at this noble thing, that noble thing is really all about just participating. Joshua 1, that's why it's echoes of that. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Don't be frightened. Don't be dismayed. That's what might, face of might does to you. Don't be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. That's why the curse is in the story of Deborah on the tribes who wouldn't participate, because they would not believe the promise from God in Joshua 1, and they would not believe the promise from God through Deborah. Take your troops, put them on the top of Mount Tabor, I will draw them out, and then you will conquer them at the river Kishon. None of that makes human sense. But from God's perspective, it was exactly what happened. It was exactly what happened. And Reuben and the other tribes wouldn't believe that up front, and they're cursed. It's a sad thing, too, as well, because as word about this probably trickled its way through the larger country, they would tell the story through the song of what happened. And I'm sure that many in those tribes that didn't contribute had mixed emotions. Part of the emotion was, well, you know, I didn't want to go, and I feel kind of guilty that I didn't go. But then the second emotion after the guilt is, but I wished I'd been there. I would have loved to have seen this. I would have loved to see God, after all these decades, engaging in his promises on our behalf and glorify God in the midst of it. And I missed it. I missed a front row seat on the promises of God making themselves known in the presence of man in what is the most remarkable upside-down circumstance that could ever be. Take your troops, put them in a vulnerable position at the top of a hill, and God will conquer 900 chariots. And I missed it because we were too busy watching the sheep. And we were too busy thinking that God couldn't do this. And after all, if we don't chase out those guys, what's the big deal to us as Reuben? The chariots aren't going to come bother us. And so let it be. Yeah. That's the cusp of the problem here. So who's vilified? Those who disbelieved God's promise against the mighty. That's who disbelieved. That's who was vilified in this story. And then rightly so. It's not, even in this story, we tend to elevate the whole story of the military conquests and the upside down, turnabout that happens with the chariots. I mean, that's all just tactically, militarily crazy stuff. It's a great story in that sense. But that's not the heart of the song, Deborah says. The heart of the song is God's glorified because what he said he would do, he did. And those who wouldn't believe him are vilified in the story. That's a big heart issue. That's at the core of this issue today, and nothing else. The military stuff, whatever. Chariots are chariots. And they are mighty. But we have a God who promised to never leave us or forsake us. In the final assessment, even for us, when we're up against, decades of chariots, and I think this is where the application comes from. I mean, decades of oppression, or just decades of problems that seem to never go away. The Israelites probably put up with Sisera and his chariots for so long, they would say, where is God in all of this? We are suffering this at the hands of these Canaanites. Where is God in the midst of this? And some of them would start to lose their faith and go to other gods, because God seems like he's asleep. And it seems like no one sees the injustice of it all. But some did. Some did understand that God was on top of this, even though the delay seems like God's not on top of this. So that finally, when a word comes forth through a demonstrated person who has a connection with God, demonstrated through her years of counseling and judging civic disputes, when finally word comes through her, some people responded and said, finally, God's never gone away. He's got this for us. And some said, psh, whatever, doesn't matter to us anyway. And in the midst of our big, what I would call chronic problems, I mean long-term issues that we deal with, we're tempted like them to go to the same place and to say, well, where's God in all this? Does he see what I'm going through? I mean, it's been so long. How could God not see this? So God must see this. maybe he doesn't love me anymore. Maybe he doesn't want to engage on my behalf. Maybe he's not motivated to be on my side anymore. I mean, these are all things that Satan kind of sticks in our head when you have long chronic conditions. And we need to go back to where Deborah was, and where Barak was, and where Joshua was. And God says, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. But Paul resonates at what can separate you from the love of God? Anything? And he goes through a whole list of cataclysmic things. Some of them chronic, some of them acute. But he goes through this whole list. Can anything separate you from the love of God? Nothing can. Nothing can. So that's really where it comes home for us on this. Many of us are dealing with the oppression of decades of chariots in our lives. Bullying, injustice, maybe chronic health conditions. And you ask yourself through the midst of all that, where is God in all of this? Has God changed? Has his love changed for us? No, we know that's the case. It hasn't changed for us. Well, but why doesn't he intercede on our behalf in the midst of such chronic problems? Doesn't he see? David, many times when he writes the Psalms, he's in the midst of these kind of chronic, unjust oppressions. And sometimes he starts off the song that he writes, which should get him a big thunderbolt in the head. He says, God, are you sleeping? Don't you see the injustice? He starts off with what's right on the top of his head. Don't you understand what's going on? Have you forgotten about me? And then he recalls to his mind the truth about who God is, about his loving kindness for us, about the fact that he's promised never to leave us. And then by the end of the psalm, he's turned the emotion of his heart around with what he understands about the rock-solid nature of the loving kindness of God. And then before he exits the psalm, without seemingly a rectification of the problem, he comes out to God and thanks him as he exits the psalm. He exits the song thanking God for what apparently God has not done yet. And why? Because God's character hasn't changed and he will engage in our behalf lovingly. Why he delays is a question we may never get answered. And he doesn't always act when we tell him he needs to act. That's okay. But we need to keep our trust in him even in the midst of chronic chariots for 2 decades in our lives and realize he hasn't left us. That's really the takeaway from the Song of Deborah. Okay, we're going to finish with this song because you can understand your own heart to understand if you're in the right place in the midst of chronic stuff. If in the chronic problems you are constantly thanking God, that's how you know that God is not off his throne, that he's still engaged on your behalf, and that even when bad things seem to never go away and you're in the midst of deep holes, his love is deeper still. Are you thanking God? Paul writes the Thessalonian church, you need to give thanks in everything. Everything? You mean the bad stuff? In the midst of the bad stuff, you need to thank God. You need to thank God because he is who he is and his love toward you hasn't changed. Don't let the circumstances fool you. He still does. So if you're giving thanks, your heart's probably in the right place. If you're in the midst of chronic chariot oppression and you're not giving thanks, then your eye is on the mighty instead of the one who loves you. That's the difference. So Psalm 107 is a great way to go out. So let me just pray and we'll sing that song. Father, we thank you for this song of Deborah. We thank you that you choose in very dramatic fashion sometimes to intercede on our behalf so that the glory is evident and is aimed toward you and not toward anything else. And Lord, as we look at this story, that's clearly the case. I mean, it's clearly the case. There's no one to praise in this story except you. Who can summon a thunderstorm from the southeast in order to tactically defeat the mightiest armed weapon system of the day? Who can make that happen? No one can, but you can. The mighty are only mighty in their own eyes. You're the one who's the Lord of all things. You're sovereign over everything. And Lord, we choose to place our trust in the sovereignty of your love toward us, the sovereignty of your grace toward us. And we pray that you'd remind us in the midst of long-suffering issues, remind us through your Holy Spirit that your love for us hasn't waned at all. It's not gone away. And to give us that kind of ability to stay under the weight of those problems and to continue to be thankful for the God whose love for us never changes. And Lord, plug our ears to when the circumstances trying to convince us to the otherwise. And Lord, I pray lastly that you would keep us from becoming Reubens. You'd keep us from being people who are more attendant to our own personal interests, even when the threats of someone else doesn't threaten us and we become insular and withdrawn and don't care. and in the process lose not only the opportunity to participate, but the opportunity to be blessed by watching you engage in the midst of those problems. Lord, we want to know who you are. We want to know you more deeply. But I sense even through this story that it may take us coming down out of our comfortable little villages through the gates into the lower valley where the mighty are, and then to put our trust in you to engage on our behalf. So Lord, keep us from listening to the whistling or in the shepherds, and attune our hearts to where you want to glorify yourself in magnificent ways. So thanks for this story, we pray, and give us more insight next week through your Spirit as we finish this song. So thanks for this in Jesus' name. Amen.